This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for being here in these troubled times. I'll try and be very distracting so you don't have to think about any world news for an hour and a half, just Harold Pinter. And I know this was a really challenging play. I heard from some of you saying, we figured out the other ones, this one, just what is it? Which I understand. So I hope we'll be able to, during the course of this class, just unpack a little bit how this play works and why. And as always, I think it's useful to go back to Pinter's own biography for a little minute, because sometimes, not always, but sometimes that's a window into a given play and where it sits in a writer's life. So let's remember, No Man's Land comes at the kind of rising peak of Pinter's early success. So, you know, The Birthday Party didn't do so well. The Caretaker was an enormous kind of public hit. So was Old Times. His work was suddenly being translated and produced all over the world. But he, and as you will recall, right, he was married to actress Vivian Merchant. They had a son, Daniel. The marriage was incredibly troubled from very early on for lots of reasons, but Vivian was an enormous alcoholic. She was very resistant to becoming a mother. She didn't want to be burdened with that. There was a lot of conflict between them, but they lived in the time that this play was written in 1974. They lived in this enormous house on Regent Street. And it's interesting because Pinter's early work was written when he was desperately poor. And you think, how did he ever get those plays done? He was acting in rep. He had a baby crawling at his feet. He couldn't make his rent. It was incredibly stressful for him. But his life didn't sort of get less stressful as he got more money for a while. Anyway, he sort of had ascended to at least the middle classes. And they were living in this vast house, which Lady Antonia Fraser, whom he then married, described as like a mausoleum. It was the emptiest, quietest place you could imagine, and very cold, and they never had anybody over, and it was this very tense, odd landscape. And this is what Pinter describes right before he wrote the play. He told this to Michael Billington in the biography. I was sitting in this taxi, and I actually saw two people sitting in a room, which is always how he first imagines a play, two people in a room. And one of them was about to pour a drink, and he said, as it is. And the other character said, as it is. Yes, please. Absolutely, as it is. I didn't know who they were, but I knew that the fellow pouring the drink was going to give the other man a drink and pour his own. I pursued that. I had that image. I was thrust into a situation where they knew more about it than I did, so I had to find out. Now, you would think, what a banal circumstance. So what? Two men having a drink. What is it? But what's interesting is that image, those two men, and by the way, Pinter never gave his characters names in the first draft of his plays. They were always A, B, C, D. He didn't always even know if it was a man or a woman, interestingly. He just knew what the image was, and he knew what he thought they said. And that question, as it is, it's such a wonderful poetic, I mean, the English say this about alcohol. When we would say, do you want it neat? Right? They say as it is, meaning, you know, do you want it neat or do you want it on the rocks? But it's such a metaphor, as what is. Yes, please, absolutely, as it is. So it's this kind of wonderful, mysterious beginning. And the manuscripts, if you go back and look at the manuscripts of No Man's Land, show us that he wrote it incredibly quickly for him. Often drafts took months and months with Pinter, but this one he wrote, you know, in a matter of days, this play, and then it took him a couple months to revise it. He could not find the title. So here are some of the titles he thought it might be. The Morning After, Faces in Shadow, A Tomb of Honor, Long Ghosts, The Drinking Party, The Photograph Album, The Bull's Head, and Closing Time. None of them very great titles. But when he got to the end of the play and the image of no man's land is articulated by Spooner, that was the image. So what is no man's land? Obviously, we read about it endlessly in war accounts of the First World War, right? Which these men would have known. In trench warfare, no man's land is the area in between the two battle lines, which belong to neither side and is the place of ultimate danger where neither side can cross. It also means no man's land, a kind of empty space belonging to no one, inhabitable by nothing. So it's a kind of amazing metaphor that evokes the First World War. It evokes war in general, but also evokes this landscape of emptiness, which is death. And I think you could say, I mean, if you had to put one line to it and say, well, what is this play about? It's a play about mortality, and the terror of mortality, and how close we all are all the time to having to negotiate our own mortality. And it's also a play that builds on that idea that we have been talking about in every class, that the past is unverifiable and mysterious and uncertain. So many things happen in this play that make you constantly revise who they are. When you first meet Hearst and Spooner, you don't have any idea whether they've ever met before, right? They look like two guys that met in a pub. And you think that the given circumstances of the play are that Hearst was at a pub in Chalk Farm, which is in North London. And by the way, remember we talked about the map of London and how precise Pinter is about it. So we used to be in Hackney in the East End, where poor Jews lived and were bombed during the war. Now we've moved to North London, much more upscale. I'm sure all of you know, or can imagine that, right? Chalk Farm, Primrose Hill, Islington, Hampstead Heath. So that part of London, which is now where, the literati and the glitterati live. So one could say it's also a play about upward mobility and about what it is to be an artist. And I think for Pinter, who was suddenly in his, late 40s, a very successful, internationally acclaimed artist, the question of what that meant and the sort of horror of success. Was he going to become someone like Hearst, who was trapped and entombed in his own ego, or was he going to be a kind of exiled, nutcase, degenerate artist like Spooner? I think was something very much on Pinter's mind. He didn't have a role model for it. He didn't know what success was meant to look like for him as an artist. So it's a very uneasy play, and you could say very dialectical play, in which, as always with Pinter, it's always relational, and the two men are kind of two halves of the same whole, in a sense, as are Foster and Briggs, the young men who take care of them. Very basic events, right? Hearst, who's a wealthy man of letters, has met Spooner, who's a kind of, you guess, minor poet, but also a kind of serving man at a pub in Chalk Farm, has invited him back to have a drink. And basically, over the course of the play, you watch Spooner, very much like Davies in The Caretaker, trying to ingratiate himself into Hearst's goodwill, while at the same time trying to sort of outflank those two very sinister servants. So in a way, it is very close in form to The Caretaker, right? So in The Caretaker, you have two young men, brothers, and you have an invader, an intruder, Davies, who's invited in, and then has to kind of navigate his way through that triangle and see if he can dominate. So Spooner is perpetually trying to establish himself in this kind of mausoleum. And you watch how the others close ranks against him and how he then tries to compete with them as Hearst drifts closer and closer towards his own death and that empty lake with the body floating in it. The tone, I would say, although the structure is in many ways like The Caretaker, the tone I think is quite different from The Caretaker. And I think it's because of the bleakness of Pinter's own life at this moment. I think it's a play that isn't sure whether the human proposition is even worth fighting for. It's quite a harsh, in some ways, indictment of the human experience. And is there any love possible between people on their way out the door. And I think, it has to do, in a sense, with that very personal anxiety that Pinter was experiencing at the time that he wrote it. And questioning sort of the nature of the artist and the role of the artist. But I also think he had written his Proust screenplay, and I think we talked about that a little bit last time. We don't have time to look at it now, but for a year before he wrote No Man's Land, Pinter had been hired to do a screenplay of Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu, and his screenplay is unbelievably beautiful. It never got produced because it's enormous. It has thousands of scenes and thousands of characters, but his immersion in the Proustian sense of how the past is always present and that people are always reinventing their own pasts in order to live in the present. He learned so much from Proust that I think finds its way into this particular play. I would say the other artist who finds his way into this play is T.S. Eliot. Pinter loved Eliot's work and knew Eliot's work backwards. And I think, and has described reading particularly, this is T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, for those of you who are poetry lovers. And there are echoes in the language of the play. Four Quartets is very Catholic, very Christian. So it doesn't have that sense of incarnation in the same way as Eliot. But I just wanted to read you two little passages from this poem that I think find their way into this play that might give you a sense of what Pinter was thinking and what the tone of this play is. This is from Little Gidding, which is the fourth poem of Four Quartets. If you came this way, taking the route you would be likely to take from the place you would be likely to come from. If you came this way in May time, you would find the hedges white again in May with voluptuary sweetness, just like the memory in this play of bucolic England, right? It would be the same at the end of the journey. If you came at night like a broken king, if you came by day not knowing what you came for, it would be the same. So that sense of circularity. When you leave the rough road and turn behind the pigsty to the dull facade and the tombstone, and what you thought you came for is only a shelf, a husk of meaning, from which the purpose breaks only when it is fulfilled, if at all. Either you had no purpose, or the purpose is beyond the end you figured, and it's altered in fulfillment. There are other places which also are the world's end, some at the sea jaws or over a dark lake. And that image of the lake and the body in the lake comes from this play, for this poem, in a desert or a city. But this is the nearest in place and time, now and in England. And then he says, what we call the beginning is often the end. And to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. And every phrase and sentence that is right, where every word is at home, taking its place to support the others, the word neither diffident nor ostentatious, an easy commerce of the old and new, the common word, exact without vulgarity, the formal word, precise but not pedantic, the complete consort dancing together. Every phrase and every sentence is an end and a beginning, every poem an epitaph. And any action is a step to the blank, to the fire, down the sea's throat, or to an ineligible stone, and that is where we start. We die with the dying. See, they depart, and we go with them. We are born with the dead. See, they return and bring us with them. The moment of the rose and the moment of the yew tree are of equal duration. A people without history is not redeemed from time, for history is a pattern of timeless moments. So while the light fails on a winter's afternoon in a secluded chapel, history is now and England. So I hope you can sort of hear, in some ways, the echoes of this poem. And the reason I read it to you is that I think, in a metaphoric sense, which you can't play when you put it on stage, and I'm going to show you how the play works moment to moment when you actually have to act it. But if you want to look at thematically the sort of metaphor of it, it is kind of about the death of a certain kind of England, right? It sounds a lot in places like Noel Coward. So it has that kind of sense of what England was pretty much before the Second World War, between the wars, but even really before the First War. A bucolic past of village greens and beautiful lawns and women with names like Annabel Hinton and that kind of Oxbridge English kind of beauty, as against what England is now, which is violent and beaten down and bombed and post-Suez and nasty and Foster and Briggs, you know. So it really is about the next generation wiping out those old men, wiping out the poets, a little bit like the younger brothers wipe out Max in The Homecoming and say, it is ours to inherit now. But who is inheriting it but these two kind of brutes? And what does that mean about old England? So I think on some level it's quite metaphoric. And so the prop, the significant prop, and remember in Pinter, we always have to start with the props and the set. The significant prop in the play is the photo album. And I just want you to think about that as we talk through the play. Why a photo album? What does that photo album represent? But the faces of the dead staring out at Hearst and his desperate attempt to hold on to his past, to hold on to some meaning, some narrative in his life by looking at these dead faces. It's very much, I think, tied, you know, to Pinter's sense of the Holocaust, of being Jewish, of knowing that there were 6 million dead, and all we remember is the faces. And once we don't tie those faces in the photo album to the people themselves, what do we remember? And I think I may have mentioned this to you in the first class when I taught you about Pinter's Jewishness overall, that this image of the photo album is echoed in Tom Stoppard's new play, Leopoldstadt. And I think Tom was really thinking of this play because the opening image of Leopoldstadt is the matriarch, the old Jewish matriarch, the woman sitting in her house, going through her family's photo album, trying to label those faces before the next generation forgets who they are. And the play, in the course of the play, comes the Holocaust, and indeed the whole family's wiped out. So I think that sense of what happened to that generation during the war is very palpable. Ironically, the 4 characters in the play were named after 4 famous cricket players. Who knew? But, you know, Pinter was an obsessive cricketer. And these were cricket players prior to 1914. And he said their names evoke memories of a golden age terminated by World War I. And I thought that was so funny. I can't tell you much more about them, and I really did try to look it up, but I'm not a cricket master by any means. But I do know that cricket and the game of cricket and the kind of dexterity and imagination and strategic sense of cricket players was something that was very much in Pinter's mind. And these names in 1970, when this play 74 was produced, these names would have evoked still to a British audience a memory of sort of the golden age of cricket, the way we might have about, you know, certain eras of baseball or football. Again, remember, it's a play about opposites and about doubles. So Foster and Briggs and Spooner and Hearst, where you sort of get genius versus lack of talent, success versus failure, the drunk and the sober, the elegant and the uncouth, the smooth and the rough, the polite and the violent, always this sort of weird dialectical activity going on between them. And some people have even speculated that Hearst and Spooner are sort of 2 sides of the same brain. And in that sense, I will just say tangentially, in case it's a play you know, that many people have compared this play to Beckett's Endgame. And I don't know if you remember Endgame when we did it at ACT in about, I would say 2011, something like that, with Bill Irwin as Ham. But it is about a man like Hearst and a sort of a man like Spooner going at it. Then they're not 2 young ones. The opposite are 2 old people in trash cans. But there are echoes of that play in there that are really interesting. And, you know, obviously for Pinter, Beckett was his great hero. And so I wouldn't be surprised if he had been thinking about that. But so think about, as we go through it, those images, the photo album, and also obviously the drinks, the pouring of the drinks, the silence that happens in the room as a drink is poured. Pinter knew exactly, he was a big drinker, how long it took to pour a drink and hand that drink over. So that was always kind of an interesting silence that he, kind of grabbed onto and was fascinated by. And also, I would say, in thinking about the photo album and thinking about the landscape of these men, it's a play about extreme loneliness. Again, maybe that's because of Pinter's own psychological state when he wrote the play, but it's quite different in that sense from The Homecoming. I know many of you found The Homecoming very violent and very peculiar, and it's hard to reconcile Ruth at the end of the play negotiating her own potential prostitution, and is that acceptable, and what does it mean? But The Homecoming is a play about family, and no matter what you think about that family, they are joined at the hip, they duke it out, they hate each other, they love each other, and they are bound at the end of the play. This is a play where there is no family. And I would say the absence of women in this play is very telling at a moment of the bleakness of his own marriage, and very despairing. Women often for Pinter are, and I don't mean in a cliched sense, the source of fertility, but I think he knew as a man how potentially violent most men are, or at least he felt that way, how litigious, how defensive, and also ultimately how vulnerable. And that men who exist in a society without women are men who are destined to be in some way vacant. And so this is a vacant play about men without women. And after this, he's about to write a play, Betrayal, which is where the woman is the prize and the two men battle for her. So that's very interesting. The history of the production is that he wrote the play quickly and it got produced incredibly quickly, which is really unusual. So he finished it in September of 74, and it was produced in the spring of 75 at the National Theatre. That's unheard of. But Peter Hall read it in the fall. He thought it was brilliant. He gave it to John Gielgud and Ralph Richardson, and they loved it, and they did it, and that was it. And that production went down in history because they were so brilliant, Richardson and Gielgud, that for many decades, nobody wanted to take the play on again because everybody thought you could never do it as well as Gielgud and Richardson. It was a very apparently fraught rehearsal period because Gielgud, who, had been traditionally quite a button down, what do I want to say, classical British actor, was completely transformed by playing Spooner, and he tried everything. He played it as a bottom feeder and as a complete psychotic. He played it as a kind of with incredible arrogance and violence. He played it really smarmy. And every day Peter Hall would write in his diaries. And by the way, Peter Hall's diaries, the collected diaries, are such great reading. If you're ever interested in how the rehearsal process really goes, I highly recommend them. It meant that he and Pinter stopped speaking for over a decade because he revealed things about Pinter that Pinter didn't want known. But the diaries are amazing. And anyway, Peter Hall was nervous that Gielgud was not going to land on a particular interpretation. He wore this baggy gray suit with very untidy hair. And this, I'm going to show you some of this if you haven't seen the film, and a sort of beer belly and sandals and kind of dirty, smelly socks. But he was very real. He was a kind of aging relic that you might meet in a pub near the BBC, Anyway, what was interesting is, for such a difficult and challenging play, No Man's Land was an immediate and enormous success, which only tells you that what's so interesting when a radical new voice enters the scene is that it takes a few plays and a few years for people to begin to know what the landscape of that writer's world is. It happened with Shepard, it happened with Mamet, it happened with Irene Fornes. By No Man's Land, people seem to know what the landscape was, even though it's such a difficult play. In many ways, I think it's his hardest play. But I think what they recognized also was embedded in the play is kind of the history of English drama. So yes, whoever just asked that, it is a spoof of the British upper classes. It's a total spoof of Oxbridge, of the way that, the Oxford Review and the Cambridge Footlights, which was Jonathan Miller and all those writers and Alan Bennett, and the kind of wit of Coward is all there in No Man's Land, and then torn apart and undercut. So you could see sort of the whole history of British dramaturgy and then where it had landed. It transferred to the West End, and right when it transferred, Pinter started his long love affair with Lady Antonia Fraser, so he couldn't even come to the opening. He had to hide out. The press was all over him. It was a very sort of strange and dislocated time for him, and sort of hard for him to celebrate the victory of it. But I think also allowed him to think about some of the questions of his own identity. So one of the questions that Spooner and Hearst wrestle with is, what does it mean to be English? And Spooner looks at Hearst and says, we're both English, aren't we? And you think, are they? Are these men English? What does it mean to be English? Are Foster and Briggs English? This is partly this sort of hidden Jewish past. We have no idea. Spooner says to Hearst, all we have left is the English language. Can it be salvaged? That is my question. And it's so the play is all language. It has very little plot, and yet I think you'll see as we walk through it that the pull of mortality is the pull of dread and the pull of terror that moves Hearst from this sort of sanctity of his central armchair, which, like Max's armchair, is the island of power in the middle of the set, and it pulls him closer and closer. He keeps falling down towards his own demise. And as that happens, the two young men take power, but sort of in a vacuum. Ralph Richardson said about the role, there isn't any plot, but that never bothers an actor. And the characters are never really rounded off. They don't quite know who they are. But that's rather natural in a way. We don't know exactly who we are, do we? We hardly know anybody else. We're a mystery to ourselves and to other people, always and forever. So that's how he kind of played it. And I think you'll see that when we take a look a little bit at some of the scenes. So the set, let's just look at the beginning, is a large room in a house in Northwest London. So right away, we're in an upper class territory. It's quite different from, that horrible attic in The Caretaker or that East End home of the butcher in The Homecoming. This, we're going to head towards real elegance of Regent's Park when we get to Betrayal. Well, but sparely furnished, a strong and comfortable straight back chair in which Hearst sits. So the throne, the power seat in the middle of the room. Then there are bookshelves and items of pottery. So you know that this is somebody refined. And there are 2 coffee mugs. That's going to be very important. There are heavy curtains across the window. Do you remember that I spoke to you about in The Homecoming, the way I tried to do in production to control light? Watch carefully in this play the way the characters obliterate each other and obliterate the outside world by controlling the light, either by turning the light off and creating a blackout, like what Lenny does in The Homecoming, or by opening the curtains or shutting the curtains. So the theatrical control of light and of the landscape is how Pinter is going to keep the pot on the boil in this play. And the central feature of the room is an antique cabinet, marble top, brass gallery, open shelves, and a great variety of bottles. So drinking in all of its manifestations is going to be the central activity of this play. Okay, so the opening is, you see Spooner standing in a very old and shabby suit, dark faded shirt, and a crease-spotted tie. You could just imagine how he smells. It's a little bit like Davies. And you have Hearst pouring whiskey. And he is meticulous, right? Precisely dressed, sports jacket, well-cut trousers. So right away, you sort of see the tramp and the elegant man, and you wonder, what is the relationship between these two men? And you hear that brilliant opening gambit, as it is. Yes, please, absolutely, as it is. Hearst brings him a glass. Thank you, how very kind, how very kind. How very kind of you, how very kind, says Spooner. Hearst pours himself a vodka. Cheers, your health. And then Hearst finishes it in one gulp. And if you track this, you'll see how drunk Hearst gets because he drinks an enormous amount. He refills his glass immediately and he sits. So let's remember in Pinter strategies of power. The person who sits is the one who controls the room. Hearst immediately sits and he makes his guests stand. This is completely bizarre. Nobody does this way. If you meet somebody in a pub and you invite them home to your house, you don't keep them standing and wandering around the room while you sit in the middle of the room and drink, but that is exactly what Hearst does. So I really want you to watch that and think about that, because it means that what is Spooner's action? His action is to desperately find a way to be kept in that room. He wants more drink. He doesn't want to be sent out into the night. We have no idea if he has any place to live or any place to go. He doesn't look like he does, but like Davies, he doesn't want to be exiled back into the real world. And so, but he's standing there and trying to make conversations. So the opening is all is sort of suspenseful. There's silence and you wonder what's going to happen. And Spooner just starts to discourse. So this is very like Davies, you know, that the person in the weaker position has to take up space by talking and hope that they find a way to kind of put a hook into the wall and stay in the room. And what he and he can't figure out why he can't get Hearst to speak. He keeps saying, "You're a quiet one." And then he says, "Oh, it's a great relief," right? Can you imagine the two of us gabbling away like me? It would be intolerable, which is true. But he's you can feel the anxiety as he sort of tries to thread a needle and figure out where he can flatter Hearst, where he can get to him, where he can try and be kept. He talks about how pleasant the room is. He talks about the strength that that Hearst demonstrates. He asks if Hearst often hangs around Hampstead Heath, which is a bit of a coded thing, perhaps about it's sort of homoerotic. Hampstead Heath, a little bit like places in Central Park, is a place where sex happens, often where men pick up men. So he asks if he hangs about in Hampstead Heath. If he often hangs about, Hearst says no. But you're on your excursions, however rare, on your rare excursions, you hardly expect to run into the likes of me, I take it. Hearst says, hardly. And so he can't get at him. And the opening is very anxious because Spooner can't manage to kind of unpack Hearst. He's the intruder and he knows it, and he can't figure out a way to make Hearst start to talk to him. And finally, he says, he tells him who he is, thinking whether this is true or not. And we don't know if he's really a poet. We have to take him on his word. Just like, when in old times, right, when Dealey says, I'm a filmmaker, I'm Orson Welles. Well, he's not Orson Welles. So is it true that he's a filmmaker? We don't know. But Spooner says, after Hearst says, you speak with the weight of experience behind you, Spooner says, and beneath me. And then he says an interesting thing. Experience is a paltry thing. Everyone has it and will tell his tale of it. I leave experience to psychological interpreters, the wet dream world. I myself can do any graphic experience you wish to suit your taste or mine, child's play. The present will not be distorted. I am a poet. I am interested in where I am eternally present and active. So that is saying, any past you want to ascribe to me, or any past you want me to make up in order to make you not be threatened by me or make you want to invite me in, I'm happy to make it up. There is no such thing as a definitive past. I don't believe in experience. I don't believe that the past is verifiable, but the present will not be distorted. So let's just live in the present. Let's forget about who we might have been in the past, and let's just drink. Well, Hearst doesn't respond to that. He stands and he goes and he pours himself another drink, at which point Spooner says, I've gone too far, you think? And you feel the anxiety of, is he going to get kicked out right now? And Hearst turns and says to him, I'm expecting you to go very much further. Really? And then he doesn't know what to say. Should he go further, or is he going to get kicked out? And he says, that doesn't mean I interest you, I hope. Hearst says, not in the least. Spooner says, thank goodness for that. For a moment, my heart sank. And he does this sort of joke about that, ending with, the point I'm trying to make, in case you missed it, is that I am a free man. Now, this is such an interesting statement. What is it to be free when you're bound to somebody else? And in Pinter, characters are always bound to each other. Nobody exists alone. Nobody can chart their own course. It's always dialectical. And at this moment, if Spooner can't get Hearst to keep him in the room, he's not going to survive, or he's certainly not going to get another drink in a warm bed or a warm meal or anything. So Hearst looks at him and says, it's a long time since we had a free man in this house. And Spooner picks up on that incredibly quickly. He says, we? Hearst corrects himself, I. But Spooner right away senses there's something else. Another, he says, is there another? Hearst doesn't answer. Another what? People, says Spooner. Person. Hearst says, what other? Spooner says, there are 2 mugs on that shelf. So has he caught him? Is he married? Is there a wife? Is there... What is happening in this house? And Hearst says, the second is for you. So you think, did he know he was coming all along? What does this mean? What is the strategy involved? It's this constant territory and recalibration. What does it mean? Is Hearst going to take the offensive at this point? And Spooner won't stop pushing it and says, and the first, and Hearst challenges him, would you like to use it? Would you like some hot refreshment? And Spooner says, that would be dangerous. I'll stick to your scotch if I may. So we can't ever find out. He's made a gambit. He's exposed his rear flank. He's tried to find out. He's crossed the no man's land, as it were, to say, who are you really? Are you married? Do you have a partner who lives here? And he can't get an answer, which is kind of wonderful, dangerous place for it to be. And then Hearst really has the advantage. And pours himself another drink, and the whole routine sort of starts over again. And so Spooner has to try other gambits, and other ways of looking at it. And I want to just show you what happens when the tension rises. And yes, absolutely, there is sexual tension going on here. There is no question that there are homoerotic tendencies all through this, which I think Pinter was very interested in, because he always thought sex equals power and power equals sex. So it's not that it's literally homosexual or literally heterosexual. He always found that between 2 individuals where lines get crossed and power starts to be exercised, it's erotic. As I said to you, he was very upset when Old Times was done as a literal lesbian drama, but it doesn't mean it's not totally homoerotic between Anna and Kate. And certainly it's the same thing with Hearst and Spooner, and the way they talk about young men. When Spooner says, I'm a staunch friend of the arts, particularly the art of poetry, and as a guide to the young, I keep open house, they come to me, they read me their verses, and on and on, this strange sort of almost grooming thing that these middle-aged men do at Jack Straw's castle, at this pub, and how they colonize these young men. So it's sort of erotic, and it's sort of dangerous, and it's completely invented. But Spooner has a really hard time getting to the point where he can pin anything on Hearst, because what he'd really love to know is, does Hearst have a past that would dictate what his present is like? How is Spooner going to find a way in to make Hearst vulnerable if he can't? He keeps throwing lifelines to him and telling him, my name is Spooner. This is who I am. This is, where I come from. He finally sits down, which is uninvited. He sits, which is quite a dramatic moment of aggression. And he finally tries to get to a shared past. He says, to your continued health, and then he invents a past. We had our cottage. When we had our cottage, we gave our visitors tea on the lawn. Hearst says, I did the same. Spooner says, on the lawn? Hearst says, I did the same. Spooner says, you had a cottage? Hearst doesn't answer. He says, tea on the lawn. Spooner says, what happened to them? What happened to our cottages? What happened to our lawns? It's sort of like saying in English drama, what happened to Noel Coward? What happened to cocktails? What happened to drama like J.B. Priestley, in which people behaved in elegant ways and wore beautiful clothes? Where has it gone? Spooner says, be frank, tell me you've revealed something. You've made an unequivocal reference to your past. Don't go back on it. We share something, a memory of the bucolic life. We're both English. And there's no answer to that, so we don't know. And then Hearst starts telling this bizarre story about in the village church, the beams are hung with garlands in honor of young women of the parish reputed to have died virgin. So, and is it men? Is it women? Is it death? It becomes this very bleak memory. So Spooner's image of happy English countryside turns into an image of death. And finally, you get to this strange moment, and I'm going to share my screen and show you. I hope you all, can you see this? Yeah. So
carried who away, yours or mine?
Is
she here now, your wife? Cowering in a locked room, perhaps? Was she ever here? Was she ever there in your cottage? It is my duty to tell you, you have failed to convince. I am an honest and intelligent man. You pay me less than my due. Are you equally being fair to the lady? I begin to wonder whether truly accurate and therefore essentially poetic definition means anything to you at all. I begin to wonder whether you do in fact truly remember her, whether you truly did love her, truly caressed her, truly did cradle her, truly did husband her, falsely dreamed, or did truly adore her. I have seriously questioned these propositions and find them threadbare. Her eyes, I take it, were hazel?
Hazel shit!
Good Lord, do I detect a touch of the maudlin? Hazel shit? I ask myself, have I ever seen hazel shit? Or hazel eyes, for that matter? Do I detect a touch of the hostile? Do I detect, with respect, a touch of too many glasses of ale, followed by the great malt which wounds? Which wounds?
Tonight, my friend, you find me in the last lap of a race I had long forgotten to run.
A metaphor. Things are looking up.
Okay, so it's such an extraordinary sequence because it tells you everything about the way Pinter's dramaturgy works. So there's a question, and you think that Spooner, in that long monologue, is going to win the point. He's going to dominate. He says, I have seriously questioned these propositions and find them threadbare. Suddenly, there's violence. Suddenly, he's gone too far. And you never know when that's going to happen, but it's incredibly dramatic, right? So you see Ralph Richardson stand up as Hearst with incredibly physical violence. He turns, goes and pours himself another drink, screams, hazel shit. Good Lord, do I detect a touch of the maudlin hazel shit? And then he throws the glass, his glass, at Spooner. Spooner has two choices. He can rise to the bait and fight, or he can undercut and be witty, which is what he decides to do. Do I detect a touch of the hostile? He comes under. Do I detect, ooh, are you a little drunk, right? The great malt that wounds, and there's silence, which is incredibly threatening. And then finally, you remember that I told you that this silence in Pinter is where the bottom just drops out, and you have no idea who's going to come out on top or who's able to go on. Finally, Hearst tells the truth. Tonight, my friend, you find me in the last lap of a race I had long forgotten to run. So that is his truth. That is unmasked. When we talk about the the you know, the mask being kept up and the way in which Pinter characters never show anything. When finally the mask is dropped, and you never know what's going to make that happen. That's what's so exciting about it. A truth gets told. And then what Spooner realizes is he can't take that on, not at that moment. He pockets it and plays the role of the poet and says in a kind of meta-theatrical way, a metaphor. Things are looking up, says the poet to the other poet. And that's because Spooner sees, he has felt the weight of Hearst's violence, and he's not going to take him on in a brawl. So he's going to have to try and come up with another strategy. So in that tiny little encounter, you can see all of the different strategies of Pinter's, linguistic strategy, and that Hazel shit. It could be done in a million different ways. It's such an odd thing. Her eyes, I take it, were Hazel, right? So is Hazel, as somebody just asked, the adjective to shit, or is it fuck you, Hazel, fuck you, or is it all of those things? It's saying you're never going to know what her eyes looked like, and I take that word and throw it back in your face, because the past is unknowable and I'm not going to be claimed by it. So suddenly the stakes go way up because the dying man has acknowledged what's happening, and the scene will never be the same. And so Spooner can edge his way in and make an offer. And what he offers is kind of to be Charon, the boatman, in ancient drama, in ancient mythology, the boatman who ferries the dead person over the river Styx into the dead. He says, "You need a friend. You have a long hike, my lad, up which presently you slog unfriended. Let me perhaps be your boatman." And of course, this is two poets, two scholars, two literati. They share the same points of reference, right? Hearst knows what he means when he says the boatman. For if and when we talk of a river, we talk of a deep and dank architecture. In other words, never disdain a helping hand, especially one of such rare quality. And it's not only the quality of my offer which is rare, it is the act itself, the offer itself, quite without precedent. I offer myself to you as a friend. Think before you speak. And then it says, Hearst attempts to move, stops, grips the cabinet. So you know that he's kind of losing at Hearst. He's not really sure what to do. And what does Spooner do? He sings this weird little song or ditty that's very like what Dealey does with the music that I played you about old times. Spooner says, "Remember this. You've lost your wife of hazel hue. You've lost her, and what can you do? She will no longer come back to you with a tilly-folly, tilly-fall-falla, falloo." You think, what is going on, this little ditty? Why are we making up poems about death? And there's a pause, and Hearst says no. And then he says something. Remember now, he's standing up. He's gripping the chair. And you think, is this man having a stroke? What is happening? It's absolutely terrifying. And he says, "No man's land, ... does not move, ... or change, or grow old, remains forever, icy, silent." He loosens his grip on the cabinet. He staggers across the room. He holds onto a chair. He waits. He moves. He falls. And think how dramatic that is in a two-character scene, a guy falling to the ground. It's such a moment of complete destruction. And then he waits. Spooner doesn't help him, right? He gets to his feet. He moves. He falls again. Spooner just sits and watches. And then he crawls towards the door as if it's a World War I scene and a soldier is crawling across no man's land to safety. He opens it and he crawls out the door. And Spooner is left there, completely still. And he says that echo of T.S. Eliot. I've known this before, the exit through the door by way of belly and floor. But he never offers to stop and help. And he's sitting there, and what happens? A third character arrives. So Pinter is so masterful at ratcheting up the stakes. And just when you think one of them is going to defeat the other, the interloper watches the boss, as it were, crawl out the door, and he's just sitting there, and in comes Foster, and it's very much like the moment when Mick arrives, if you remember, right at the height of the action between Aston and Davies. Remember when Mick arrives and says, "What's the game?" So in this case, it's Foster arriving, and Spooner is just standing there, and he's terrified, and the door opens, and this guy comes in casually dressed and stands staring at Spooner, and there's just silence between them, and you think, what's going to happen? And then Foster says, "What are you drinking? Christ, I'm thirsty. How are you? I'm parched." And he completely sort of kneecaps Spooner. Spooner doesn't know, what is he supposed to do now, right? And Foster just takes over the space. And in Pinter, how do you take over the space? You don't stop talking. You keep talking and talking. He talks about, not carrying a gun in London, but he used to carry a gun. "Have you met our host? He's my father," he says. And you think, is that true? Is this his son? "It was our night off tonight." You think, no, well, he's really his servant. Spooner says, "I'm a friend of his." Foster doesn't believe it. "You're not typical." And then Briggs comes in. So now it's a triangle. And remember, triangles in Pinter, 2 against 3, somebody's always going to get detonated. Briggs comes into the room. There's an incredible sort of tension between them. And Briggs says, "Who's this?" Right? And Foster mocks Spooner ruthlessly. His name's Friend. "This is Mr. Briggs, Mr. Friend, Mr. Briggs. I'm Mr. Foster. Old English stock. John Foster, Jack Foster, Old English name. Foster, John Foster, Jack Foster, Foster. This man's name's Briggs." So it's a sort of joke again about what does it mean to be English? Who gets to claim it? Who's Old English stock? These two thugs don't look like Old English stock. They don't sound like Old English stock. They have a kind of working class dialect, it sounds like. And they're on to Spooner right away. Briggs says, "You collect the beer mugs from the tables in a pub in Chalk Farm." Spooner tries to hold on to his dignity. "The landlord's a friend of mine. When he's short-handed, I give him a helping hand," because he's trying to pretend he's a poet, right, Spooner? But they know he's just a scum. He's nothing. He's like them. "Who says the landlord's a friend of yours?" "He does." "I'm talking about the Bull's Head." Yes, so am I. So it gets very threatening. The two guys form this kind of dangerous triangle power play against Spooner. And they don't trust anything about him. They mock him. They take up space. They tell him some things about themselves. And then Spooner, in desperation, tells them a story. "I've been to Amsterdam," he says. And you think, what does that have to do with anything? I mean, that was the last place I visited. I know Europe well. So this is him trying to get back to his sort of mythology about being a man of the world, a poet, a literati who goes everywhere. And he describes an image that he saw in Amsterdam and that he would like to have painted. And what do they guess the title of this painting might have been? It has no impact. They don't believe it. "Did you ever paint that picture?" "Not yet, I'm afraid." "Don't leave it too long," they say threateningly. "You might lose the inspiration." "Ever painted a beer mug?" They just treat him as a con artist. So that strategy didn't work at all. And they start to mock him and dominate him. And then Foster fights back and says, gives his own monologue and says, as he pours another drink, "What do you make of this? When I was out east once, a kind of old stinking tramp," he says, looking at Spooner as if this is about him, "bollock naked, asked me for a few bob. I didn't know him. He was a complete stranger, but I could see immediately he wasn't a man to trust." So this is the way you use the past to be a weapon against the present. So everything that Foster is saying here is about his relationship to Spooner in the present tense. He was a complete stranger, but I could see immediately he wasn't a man to trust. He had a dog with him. They only had about one eye between them, so I threw them some kind of coin, he says, as he's pouring this guy a drink. He caught this bloody coin, looked at it with a bit of distaste, and then he threw the coin back. Well, automatically I went to catch it. I clutched at it, but the bloody coin disappeared into thin air on its way toward me. Then he let out a few curses and pissed off with his dog. "Oh, here's your whiskey, by the way. What do you make of that incident?" Spooner says, "He was a con artist." right? Not like me. Do you think so? You would be wise to grant the event no integrity whatsoever. And Foster says, you don't subscribe to the mystery of the Orient? A typical Eastern contrick, says Spooner. Double Dutch, you mean? Certainly, your good health. So he's been completely discomfited. And what happens right at that moment? Hearst reappears, the guy who crawled out across no man's land, sort of like having a stroke. And what does he look like now? Completely in charge of his facilities. He's wearing a beautiful dressing gown. Briggs goes and poured him a whiskey. And Hearst seems on top of the world. My goodness, is this for me? How did you know? You knew. You're very sensitive, he says to Briggs. Cheers, the first today. What day is it? What time is it? Is it still night? And this goes to this beautiful echo of the four quartets, where as you go towards death, time stops. It's completely circular. You don't know whether we're at the beginning or the end of the cycle. Is this person whole or broken? Is there any connective tissue between this person and the person who walked out the door? And I just want to read you one other thing before we take our break, which is also from T.S. Eliot, because I think it helps explain what's going on here. This is from a play of T.S. Eliot's, which is called The Cocktail Party. It's not a great play. T.S. Eliot wasn't a great playwright, but there's a theme in there that Pinter is very much in sympathy with, which is this. A character in the play says, but we die to each other daily. What we know of other people is only our memory of the moments during which we knew them. And they have changed since then. To pretend that they and we are the same is a useful and convenient social convention, which must sometimes be broken. We must also remember that at every meeting, we are meeting a stranger. So one of the things that Pinter's trying to dramatize is the question, and it happens in real life, when you meet somebody and then you see them again on the bus and they don't look or sound anything like they were. Pinter wants to remind you that we're always playing a role in life, that role is a mask, that the mask changes moment to moment depending upon the circumstance. And then when a character leaves and comes back, we have to ask ourselves, is this Hearst in his dressing gown, absolutely on top of the world, the same Hearst that crawled out 5 minutes before looking like he was having a stroke? Does this Hearst know Spooner in a way that the former Hearst didn't know? Is this Hearst these men's father or not? And how are we going to evaluate what happens next? I know it feels confusing, and it feels anxious to watch a play when no relationship has any seeming continuity. But I think in a way it makes the present tense of the play really delicious. You just have to stay in the present moment, ask what the game is, hold on to the strategies between these people in the present moment, and now ask the big question. Now, for the first time, all four characters are on stage. What's going to happen? Okay, so let's take our break here. It is 1:57, so a little bit after 2. Whatever you think, Alfredo, like a couple of 3 minutes after 2.
Yeah, 2:03 is perfect.
Okay, great. Take a break and we'll be right back.
Thanks, Professor. See you all in a bit. Take it away.
Okay. Let me just expand this. Right. Good. So we'll just work through a little more towards the end of the play. I think what happens at the moment, right after we left, when he comes back in, is that Hearst gives this speech that is triggered by his photo album. My true friends look out at me from my album. I had my world. I have it. Don't think now that it's gone. I'll choose to sneer at it, to cast out. We're talking of my youth, which can never leave me. I think this is one of the most extraordinary speeches really written in contemporary drama about mortality, about trying to confront your relationship to your own past and also the terror of your present encounter with your impending mortality. And it's very redolent of another Beckett play you may know called Krapp's Last Tape, a great, great play in which an old man listens to himself having recorded a yearly tape diary of his life. And he goes back, the old man, and listens to sections of the earlier tape. It's really remarkable. And it's It has echoes of that when, first Hearst says, help yourself, I hate drinking alone. There's too much solitary shittery, he says. And then he says, what was it? Shadows, brightness, through leaves, gambling, in the bushes, young lovers, a fall of water. It was my dream, the lake. Who was drowning in my dream? He keeps having memories of both beautiful memories of his past and terrifying memories. Somebody is doing me to death. Then it has that real Beckettian echo. She looked up. So memories of love. I was staggered. I had never seen anything so beautiful. That's all poison. We can't be expected to live like that. And then he says, I remembered nothing. I'm sitting in this room. I see you all, every one of you. A sociable gathering. The dispositions are kindly. Am I asleep? There's no water. There's no one drowning. And he says, yes, yes, come on, come on. Come on, pipe up, speak up, speak up, speak up. You're fucking me about, you bastards. Ghosts, long ghosts, you're making noises. I hear you. So in a sense, Hearst is having a full-blown anxiety attack. His whole past is coming up to haunt him. And Spooner throws Hearst a bone. He wants to find a way into this anxiety that means he'll be necessary. And he says, it was I drowning in your dream. And again, Hearst falls to the floor. They all go to him. Foster says, bugger off. And Spooner says something that's like Lear and Gloucester to these young men, because absolutely, as some of you have been commenting in the chat, this is about generational competition and generational change. And Spooner looks at these two young thugs as if to say, your generation's never going to help my generation. You're just going to kick us to the curb. He says to them, he has grandchildren, as have I, as I have. We both have fathered. We are of an age. I know his wants. Let me take his arm. Respect our age. Come on, I'll seat you. He takes Hearst, he leads him to a chair, and he says, there's no pity in these people. And in a sense, he's right. So even though Spooner is a complete, con artist in his own way, when he says, I am your true friend, that is why your dream was so distressing. You saw me drowning in your dream. And Foster says, Christ, the young men realize that the old guys, in a way, are actually, aligned there. And whether this is a stroke that Hearst is having, some kind of, as you say, psychotic break, a panic attack about his present moment, what you see is the connection between the past and the present is what these characters are fighting for. If you can't stake a claim in your own past and make that narrative mean something to you, then you are nothing in your own present. You're just a vacuum, a void. And the past feels like nothing. And this is going to become even more important when we get to Betrayal. This need to keep recreating a past that's going to give your present life some sense of meaning. And if there is no meaning, then you're dying with nothing, right? Without a connection in the world, without anybody to mourn you. And so as we move towards the end of the act, and the young men are trying to kind of keep order and talk about, making sandwiches and things like that. You get a lot of the panic that happened, sort of even from the birthday party when a routine is broken. So these young men can only control Hearst if they can control what he drinks, what he eats, when he goes to bed, when he gets up, and they're starting to lose control. And this starts to be a kind of frightening thing for Foster and Briggs. And Foster and Briggs start fighting with each other, which is never a good thing, because then you realize that, everybody is alone, and even Foster and Briggs don't share the same objective. So Foster says, we deal in originals, nothing duff, nothing ersatz. We don't open any old bottle of brandy. Mind you, don't fall into a quicksand. And he says to Briggs, why don't I kick his head off and have done with it? So, should we just kill him? What should we do? And Spooner keeps asserting the rights of old age. I'm the same age as your master. I used to picnic in the country too, at the same time as he. right? And Foster tries to drive a wedge between them. Listen, my friend, this man in this chair, he's a creative man. He's an artist. We make life possible for him. We're in a position of trust. Don't try to drive a wedge into a happy household. So he threatens him. You understand me? Don't try to make nonsense out of a family life. And you think, what family? Are these people family? You know, it's a kind of everybody out for himself moment. And Foster starts to panic. And the real panic, and this takes us all the way back to Meg in the birthday party, when she comes in Act 3 and Stanley's been taken away. And when she says, I'm out of cornflakes. You remember that? And she absolutely panics because cornflakes are not only a metaphor for the quotidian life, they are how she earns her place in the world. And without cornflakes, she's going to be taken away too. So Briggs comes back in an absolute panic and says, we're out of bread. I'm looking at the housekeeper. Neurotic poof, he prefers his idleness, he says. And again, a homoerotic thing. You know, these two gay men, are they lovers? What are they? And he attacks the other man and says, unspeakable ponce. These are all words for gay in British English. He prefers the Malay Straits, where they give you hot toddy and a four-poster. He's nothing but a vagabond cock. Then he says to Spooner, move over. And it gets really violent because they're out of bread. And how are they going to reclaim their space? Spooner moves away. Briggs says to Hearst, get up. Hearst stands up. Briggs leads him to the door. And he says, keep on the move. Don't look back. Hearst turns around. He looks at Spooner and says, I know that man. And suddenly they're out of the room. And it's only Foster and Briggs at the end of the act. And you're absolutely terrified. Like Foster could kill Briggs if he wanted to, right? This is a tough man. I'm going to share my screen again for a minute and show you something else here, which is, sorry, I'm going to move it slightly forward to 47. And I just want you to watch what happens here. It's
Move over!
So he gets him up.
Get up.
Again, that intimacy. Is it a hug or is it a fight? He starts to lead him. Spooner doesn't move. Now watch what Hearst does. He turns around.
Keep on the move. Don't look back. I know that man.
He's let off. The door shuts. Now what's going to happen between these two men? Feel the weight of that silence. Look at Foster circling Spooner like his prey. Spooner has to pretend that he's
You know what I saw once in the desert? In the Australian desert? A man walking along carrying two umbrellas. Two umbrellas in the outback.
Was it raining?
No, it was a beautiful day. Nearly asked him what he was up to, but I changed my mind.
Why?
Well, I decided he must be some kind of lunatic. I thought he would only confuse me.
Okay, now he's coming behind him, which is really dangerous. What is Spooner going to do? Look at that posture and the key around his neck.
You know what it's like when you're in a room with the light on and then suddenly the light goes out? I'll show you. It's like this.
So there you go. And he's just erased Spooner. He doesn't have to kill him. He doesn't have to touch him. He can just put him in the dark. And look how scared Spooner is now when he wakes up. He kind of looks around. And the whole lighting scheme, it's very hard to tell in film, is again controlled by the next generation, by the young ones who bring the light back into the room. So it's just an extraordinarily theatrical moment that happens at the end of that act, and it really rising action. You think, how could you create suspense? But you do, because the audience goes off at intermission and thinks, is Spooner going to get killed? Is he going to be there when we come back? Is Hearst dead? Is he ever going to come back? And the whole opening part of the act is Briggs bringing Spooner this breakfast that's supposed to be for the financial consultant who didn't show up. And again, in a masterful theatrical way, Pinter really wants Spooner to eat the whole breakfast. So how do you do that? You have the other person give a monologue that lasts the exact time it would take an actor to eat eggs and toast and butter the toast and eat the scrambled eggs and drink the champagne. And Pinter, because he's an actor, he knows exactly how long that takes, right? And so he has this extraordinary speech that Briggs gives about the maze at Bolsover. And I'm not going to play the whole thing for you, but if you haven't watched it, you should watch it because it's hilarious. And it's about somebody trapped in a car trying to drive somewhere that you can't get to. And it's a sort of metaphor of the completely futile labyrinth from which none of these characters can ever get out. And you start to feel for the young ones because you think they should inherit something, whether they're the children, the servants, whether they're lovers or not. And they're trapped in the same kind of horrifying landscape of the two old men, where all of them are in this bizarre dead end labyrinth where you keep driving through a maze of wonders, but you never get out the other side, and Briggs, Briggs is the kind of thug, and Foster is the brains. And it's often like that in Pinter when you have two, it's like Goldberg and McCann. McCann is the intellectual one who gets charming and keeps talking, but McCann is the thug who's the real killer. Or it happens with Gus, in The Dumbwaiter, if you know that play. There always is this kind of Tweedledum and Tweedledee where one is the intellect and one is the brawn, the brains and the brawn. So Briggs is the brawn, and he's incredibly, he just doesn't know how to shut up or deal with Spooner, who tries to work his wiles, and it just doesn't work. But there's some hilarious dialogue. Spooner is talking about being a champagne drinker and knowing his wines, and he goes to Dijon in his 30s with his French translator in order to get wine. And he says to Briggs, you will wonder, of course, what he translated. The answer is my verse. I'm a poet. And Briggs looks at him in complete disbelief and says, I thought poets were young. Now, any other writer would have the character say something like, not always, or poets can be old, or what makes you think that? And Spooner says, I am young. It's such a brilliant line. It completely defies all reality. He's this crazy old man sitting there, but he claims his reality. And that's what's amazing about Spooner, is that he always claims his own reality. Now he knows he's been trapped by the heavy, and he gets scared, and he starts to say, oh, you've reminded me, I must be off. I have a meeting at 12. Thank you so much for breakfast. What meeting? And he keeps talking about what he's going to do, and they're having a poetry reading, and all these elegant people are coming. And it becomes clear Briggs has no intention of letting this guy get out of the room. And it becomes a kind of intense, really frightening rivalry between them, where Spooner sort of doesn't know what to do and how to cope. But Briggs says something that Spooner knows he can hang his hat on. So Briggs is talking about his patron, his boss, and he says, not that the boss isn't a very kind man. He is. He's a very civilized man, but he's still human. And suddenly Spooner says, the boss? Oh, Briggs has just said, perhaps it's because he's a poet himself. Well, that gives Spooner another way in. He says, the boss is a poet himself, rivalry, but also familiarity. I could bond with him. I could compete with him on the poet-to-poet level. And Briggs says, don't be silly. He's more than that, isn't he? He's an essayist and a critic as well. He's a man of letters. Spooner says, I thought his face was familiar. Then the telephone buzzes. And all of a sudden, Hearst walks in, and he's like yet again a different character. He's very elegant. He's wearing a beautiful suit, completely beautifully dressed. And he says, he addresses everybody with a completely different name, and he looks at Spooner and says, Charles, how nice of you to drop in. Have they been looking after you all right? And then he says to Briggs, Denson, let's have some coffee. And then he looks back at Spooner. You're looking remarkably well, haven't changed a bit. It's the squash, I'll expect. Keeps you up to the mark. You were quite a dab hand at Oxford, as I remember. Still at it? Wise man. Sensible chap. My goodness, it's years. Now, this is so brilliant, because whether it's true or not, whether they actually went to Oxford together before the war or not, what does it do? It gives Hearst back completely the upper hand. And now they can have a conversation about all these things that they invent about their past, about infidelity, about who fucked whose wife. Is the summer memory true? He completely kneecaps Spooner with these details about the flowers and the hands and the club and the poetry and the war. And the more details they offer, the realer it becomes, particularly when they get to names, right? Bunty Whitstanley. If you know Noel Coward's play Private Lives, or let's say Brief Encounter, these are all the names from sort of the gay repartee that comes in a Noel Coward play. And suddenly, just as we are in old times, we're back in time. The stakes are huge. They're having a literary battle, the two men, and you think, oh my God, have they gone back in time? Did they know each other then? Or is this the strategy that two old men use when they want to hold on to their lives and their power against two young men who have no idea who they are and want to inherit the castle? So, it's hilarious and very, you have to play it absolutely straight. And that's what I would say, to the actors doing it. Annabelle Hinscott, yes, I knew her at Oxford, says Hearst. Spooner says, so did I. I was very fond of Arabella, says Hearst. Spooner says, Arabella was very fond of me. Bunty was never sure of precisely how fond she was of me, not of what form her fondness took. What in God's name do you mean? So the stakes are like men talking about having had their wives taken away from them, even though we've suddenly gone back in the past. And the two young men are standing there like the audience, staring at them like they're watching a play, thinking, what is happening? And can I interrupt it all? Or do I have to defend one or the other of them? And Hearst starts to get incredibly angry at Spooner for having seduced his wife and says, I'm beginning to think you're a scoundrel. How dare you speak of Annabella Hinscott in such a fashion? I'll have you blackballed from the club. And Spooner says, oh, my dear sir, may I remind you that you betrayed Stella Whitstanley with Emily Spooner, my own wife, throughout a long and soiled summer, a fact known at the time throughout the home counties. So it's sort of hilarious, but it's also terrifying. It's this complete parody of all the literary types that, by the way, Harold Pinter would have met now that he was a famous playwright and a member of every club. When you go to the Garrett Club, these are the kind of people you hear speaking, and he would have known it. And they try to compete as poets. When Spooner says, I wrote my homage to Wessex in the summer house, and Hearst says, I never had the good fortune to read it. And Spooner said, it is written in terza rima, a form which, if you will forgive my saying so, you have never been able to master. So suddenly, they're battling out who's the better poet. Hearst, Briggs starts to pour whiskey. They're so drunk by this time they can barely stand. And suddenly we're back in the present, and Hearst is talking about his photo album. And what you realize is all the images in the photo album are those lives which are more present to him than anything that happened in the past. And he says, it's an incredibly moving speech, I think. He says, allow the love of a good ghost. They possess all that emotion, trapped. Bow to it. It will assuredly never release them, but who knows what relief it may give to them? Who knows how they may quicken in their chains, in their glass jars? You think it cruel to quicken them when they are fixed in prison? No, deeply, deeply. They wish to respond to your touch, to your look, and when you smile, their joy is unbounded. And so I say to you, tender the dead, as you would yourself be tendered now in what you would describe as your life. And I think what he's saying is, remember me. whatever you make up, everybody here in the room, when I'm gone, which I'm about to be, and I'm only a picture in your photo album, remember who I was and what I stood for and what my poetry was like. Do that for the dead. So, there's some kind of extraordinary self-awareness going on there, I think, at the end of the play. This sort of eulogy that's completely undercut by the two young men, because the young men have no interest in, young people don't know what it means to be terrified of their own mortality, and they're not, and they're not going to indulge it in any way. But Spooner does. And Spooner completely understands Hearst's despair. So as we get to the end of the act, and Spooner says, you mentioned a photograph album. I could go through it with you. I could put names to the faces. A proper exhumation could take place. Yes, I'm confident I could be of enormous aid in that area. You sort of think they could. These two old men could be useful to each other, but they can't because the young won't tolerate it. Foster says, those faces are nameless, friend. And Briggs says, and they'll always be nameless. And Hearst says, there are places in my heart where no living soul has or ever can trespass. And so, the lines are really clearly drawn between these four men. Who's going to inherit and what the competition is. Spooner begs. He says, I ask you to consider me for the post. If I were wearing a suit such as your own, you'd see me in a different light. I'm extremely good with tradespeople. He begs exactly the way that Davies begs at the end of the Caretaker, to be kept there. And it's a long and desperate speech, which Hearst will not countenance. He says, let us change the subject for the last time. And now we know that we're kind of on the downward slope towards Hearst's end, really. And I just want to play you the very last sequence because it's so extraordinary, the language here.
Let us change the subject for the last time. What have I said?
You said you're changing the subject for the last time.
Yes, but what does that mean?
It means you'll never change the subject again.
What, never?
Never.
Never?
You said for the last time.
Yes, but what does it mean? What does that mean?
It means forever. It means that the subject is changed once and for all, and for the last time forever. If the subject is winter, for instance, it'll be winter forever.
Is the subject winter?
The subject is now winter, so it'll therefore be winter forever.
And for the last time.
Which will last forever. If the subject is winter, for example, spring will never come.
Yes, but I must ask you, let me ask you.
Summer will never come.
The trees
will never bud.
But I must ask you.
Snow
will fall forever. Because you've changed the subject for the last time.
Yes, but have I? That's my question. Have we changed the subject?
Of course. The previous subject is closed.
What was the previous subject?
It's forgotten. You've changed
What
it.
is the present subject?
That there is no possibility of changing the subject since the subject has now been changed.
for the last time.
So that nothing else will happen forever. You'll simply be sitting here forever.
But not alone.
No. We'll be with you, Briggs and me.
It's night.
And will always be night.
Because the subject
Can never be changed.
But I hear sounds of birds. Don't you hear them? Sounds I never heard before. I hear them as they must have sounded then when I was young. Although I never heard them then, although they sounded about us then. Yes, it is true. I am walking towards a lake. Someone is following me through the trees. I lose him easily. I see a body in the water floating. I'm excited. I look more closely. I see I am mistaken. There is nothing in the water. I say to myself, I saw a body drowning. But I am mistaken. There is nothing there.
No. You are in no man's land, which never moves, which never changes, which never grows older, but which remains forever, icy and silent.
I'll drink to that.
And watch him in his throne, and how this image slowly turns into a photograph, a black and white photograph that will end up in a photo album, and probably no one will remember who he was. So it's incredibly beautiful, I think, and very much towards the end of the play about the will to live. Which is a very active thing to play. So as the actor playing Hearst gets to the end of this cycle, the young men are trying to force him to play by the rules of his own game. And one of the rules is, if you change the subject, you can't go back, right? It's like an improv game. So once we say, these are the rules, you do this. And then when the subject is changed and you go this way, then you can never go back. So basically, they're trying to kill him off linguistically. It's winter. It will never be spring again. You can never go back and live again. You can't change your mind. But within that constriction, as it gets tighter and tighter and tighter, is somebody saying, I hear the sound of birds. Don't you hear them? And even more poignant, sounds I never heard before, because I think one of the things that Pinter's always writing about is, which we all always feel, is that we didn't appreciate our youth when we had it. You know, he says, I hear them as they must have sounded then when I was young, although I never heard them then. You know, we're too busy. And suddenly it gets silent, and there are all the sounds of the world going by, and we wish we could just hear them one more time. And Spooner is in this kind of liminal place describing where he is. And yet the last thing is a kind of positive gesture on Hearst's part saying, I'll drink to that. So we have no idea, what it is actually that we're trying to, whether it ends on a very bleak note or a very hopeful note. It's true, you couldn't pull this off with anything less than superb actors. That is absolutely true. And I will say, that No Man's Land, more than almost any other Pinter, requires an incredible depth of inner life. In other words, one of the things that an actor needs to do in Pinter, because it's so masked, you have to be very clear where the mask drops and where you suddenly see somebody's vulnerability. But it's up to an actor to fill that inner life with so much richness that when the mask actually falls, the terror is there. I mean, if you are playing a human being who is living in mortal terror of his own incipient death, there are a lot of emotions in there, enormous numbers of emotions that you have to have access to, so that at the moment that you're playing Hearst and you finally reveal it, we see the depth of that despair. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to do without it leaching out. In rehearsal, what I would say that we often do in Pinter, I often do, is I'll do a rehearsal which is very naked, where I say to them, don't mask it, don't try and contain the language, just show all of your fear, all of your vulnerability, blow it all out so you remember what that feels like. Then you can always learn to cover it again, to really be decorous, to not move or not betray until the moment comes. And what it means is you also, and you have to be in very good shape physically. I think you can see this doing Pinter, because the moves are like karate moves. Do you know what I mean? So at the moment when he falls down, or where Briggs suddenly turns and it gets violent for a minute, you have to have an actor who's so coiled and so taut that you really believe, is this person going to physically attack somebody else, or is it that the language is going to attack somebody else? And in the end, I think, for Pinter, in a way, what saves Spooner and Hearst are their imaginations. And I do think that that is the thing. If you had to say, is there anything that Pinter really believed in? I think he really believed in the power of art, not art as something didactic that makes a point or points a finger, but in the power of the imagination to recreate, to empathize, to create the past over and over again. And that's why he started writing about artists. And that becomes a theme that's going to happen with him, over and over again. It's actually not true. Whoever said Pinter actors do not rely on gestures. The gestural language is incredibly important. It just has to be really precise. In other words, those rules of play I talked to you about, that you don't walk and talk at the same time. If you're going to pour a drink, the pouring of the drink is the action, and the sound of the liquor hitting the glass is what fills that silence. And the way the glass is lifted and the person moving towards the person they give it to is the action. And it all has to be really clean, and nothing else can muddy it, But suddenly when somebody picks up an empty glass, if the gesture is really strong, you think, are they going to pour another, or are they going to throw the glass at that guy's head? And once he does throw it at Spooner's head, it could happen a second time, right? Once violence is unleashed, it can always be unleashed again. So you're sort of on pins and needles, And so I think the other question is about what is the role of art, and can the making of art, or the reading of art, or the experiencing of art save somebody from despair or from mortality in some way? What is the role of art in memory and in remembering other people, or remembering an event? And I think that's something that Pinter and Stoppard really share. And again, I would go back to their wartime experience and the fact that these were two children of the Holocaust who grew up in wartime in a period of immeasurable loss. And so the sense that it was incumbent upon them as artists in some way to remember, to think about the past, to keep the past alive in the present, is something that we're going to find over and over again. Anything else that struck you, or that we didn't hit, that you're curious about in this play? That I hope some of this made it somewhat more clear to you. I know this is a hard one, really a hard one. Next week's is going to feel easier in some ways. Next week is Betrayal, his very brilliant 3-character play that goes backwards in time. And interestingly, this one, there was a very brilliant film made, and it's not a film that is just the recording of the play version, which is the one I just showed you, really is just a kind of film capture of the Ralph Richardson Gielgud stage production. But David Jones, in about 1980, I think, 83, made a remarkable film of Betrayal, with Ben Kingsley and Patricia Hodges and Jeremy Irons. And it is a proper film. It's not, although it follows the text of the play, it doesn't exactly follow the text of the play. And I'll tell you one very funny thing about it in case you watch it and think you're getting, like, your machine is broken. The opening is silent because you're seeing the characters through a window. And in the screening of the film, when it was first screened, people in the audience kept yelling, "Turn the sound up," because it looks like you should be hearing the dialogue. And what you're hearing is the silence of the dialogue through the window. And then eventually the camera goes inside and you hear what's going on. So it's quite funny. So if you can't hear it when you listen to it, you can get it free on YouTube. It's not a great cut of it, and you can get it better if you go on and want to pay for it on Amazon Prime or Criterion. But if you just want to watch it free, go on YouTube and just write Betrayal 1983, and you'll get the film. As always, I encourage you to read the play regardless, or read the play instead of watching it. But if you're finding it helpful to read it and then see, this is the ultimate play about sexual politics, power and sexuality, the power of memory, the loss of innocence, the loss of love, the way that men compete with each other about women, and the way a woman can sometimes save men from their own emotional emptiness. Yes, absolutely. Pinter was central to the casting of No Man's Land. Somebody just asked. Was central to the casting of all his work. And when I worked with him in New York, I had to submit the actors I wanted to work with and their headshots and resumes, and he had to approve Peter Riegert, David Strathairn, Gene Stapleton. He was very involved in the casting because he was an actor himself, and he knew that 80% of the success of anything was the casting. And somebody asked about the Patrick Stewart version of No Man's Land, which I thought was, what do I want to say? I didn't think it worked. And I didn't think it worked because Patrick Stewart has no sense of humor. I know that sounds ridiculous to say, but Hearst, on some level, as I think Ralph Richardson shows you, has to be charming and vulnerable. And you have to believe when he makes up the past that he had wit in his past life, and that they were peers somehow. And I thought he was very stentorian, and that Ian McKellen was a little over the top. I thought Billy Crudup was really interesting as Foster, was kind of fantastic and dangerous. But what I thought they didn't get about Foster and Briggs is Foster and Briggs' own terror as the next generation at whether there was going to be anything left to inherit for them. You know, nobody wins in Pinter. That's what's really important. It's the heartbreaking thing is that we sort of live in a vulnerable place in which we're all always trying to protect ourselves from our own vulnerability while finding other people's weak spots. And so we're on a seesaw that changes moment to moment. And the best you can hope for is to keep creating a narrative about your own past that makes you feel better about your own present. Do you know what I mean? And so that's where I think Pinter is really moving. And I think his own sense of loss, and also the way that he's suspicious of success, even though he was so successful by the time he wrote Betrayal. Look at the loneliness of those characters. And I would say, look at the way that they drink, because this is such a British trope. It's an Irish trope too, in order to get through their day. And how lost they are, and how they're looking for love in all the wrong places. It's a fantastic play. So this one I think you'll really enjoy. And then the last week is Celebration and The Room. These are two one-acts. The Room is his very first play before the birthday party, and he paired it when he wrote Celebration in 2001. They were done on stage together, so we did them right at 9/11. And I'm going to show you there's not a lot of video of it, but I'm going to show you photographs of our production and tell you how we went about that particular one. So I think we're good. What is Larry saying? Stuart has been interested. Oh, he had a sense of humor in the interview. It could be true. And I think absolutely, and I don't mean to ever blame anything on an actor. I think it's always in the direction. And I would just say about Pinter, be wary of any production that takes itself too seriously. Do you know what I mean? The joy I found of working with Pinter is that he had a lot of humility and a huge sense of humor, and you can't be smarter than he is or try and impose things on him that are bigger than he did. Let the magic tricks detonate. Have a little humility when you get there, and don't make them now modern classics. Do you know what I mean? That also happens with O'Neill or Tennessee Williams when we're too reverent and we say, this is now a classic and you have to take it seriously. I always think, approach it as a new play, because for most of the audience, it will be a new play. They've never seen it before. They're seeing it for the first time. There's such joy in that. So honor it, honor the stage directions, but let the play speak for itself if you possibly can. Okay, I think I'm over. So thank you for today, and I will see you next Tuesday with Betrayal. Okay? All right, Alfredo? Anything you need to say? No, we're good? Any questions you have, just feel free to keep sending them through to Alfredo and they'll get to me. Okay. Okay. See you next week.